Your brain is physically rewiring itself right now, but probably in ways that are making your life worse. The scary part, most people reinforce the same negative patterns every single day without realizing it. But in the next 30 days, you can intentionally change that. A few years ago, I noticed something strange. Every evening, I'd sit down to relax for just 10 minutes or so, and somehow I'd lose like an hour scrolling, snacking, distracting myself. And afterwards, I didn't feel better, felt worse because of what I was doing, but actually because I couldn't seem to stop doing it. That's when I realized this wasn't a motivation problem. My brain had learned and it was running on repeat. I'm a chartered psychologist and I've spent years studying how habits, thoughts, emotions, and repeated behaviors shape the brain. But I'm not just approaching this as a psychologist, I'm also neurodivergent, which means change never felt simple for me. My brain likes patterns, it likes certainty, and it likes knowing what comes next. When people say, just change your mindset or just build a new habit, I know how frustrating that can sound because for some of it, change doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it can feel genuinely unsafe. That's why I became so interested in neuroplasticity, not as a buzzword, not as a quick fix, but as a real evidence-based process for changing the patterns your brain has learned. And what I discovered is this: rewiring your brain is not about becoming a completely different person. It's about teaching your brain through repetition, the right conditions, that a different response is possible. So in this video, I'm going to show you what actually changes the brain, why motivation is not enough, and how long it really takes, according to the research, not the number you've probably heard online. Let's start with the biggest myth. By adulthood, your brain is basically fixed. It isn't. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to physically change its structure and function based on what you repeatedly think, feel, and do. Your brain is not fixed. It is constantly adapting every day, every moment, shaping itself around your patterns, which means this: you are always reinforcing something, old pathways or new ones. There is no neutral. I once worked with a client who noticed she would immediately assume she'd done something wrong anytime someone didn't reply to a message. There was no evidence, just an instant drop in her stomach and that spiral of overthinking. That reaction wasn't random. It was a well-worn neural pathway. And that's the important thing to understand. The brain is constantly reinforcing the patterns you repeat. Here's a really good way to picture it. Imagine your brain like field covered in fresh snow. Every thought, every behavior, every emotional reaction creates a track. And the tracks you've used the most become deep paths, easy to follow, most automatic. These are your default patterns, the one your brain takes you without asking. Now, imagine trying to create a new path. You have to push through untouched snow. It's slower, it's uncomfortable, it doesn't feel natural. Each time you go that way, the path becomes clearer, easier, more familiar, and eventually that new path can become your default. That is neuroplasticity. The neuroscientist Donald Hebb summed it up in this one sentence: neurons that fire together. You might have heard it. Every time you repeat a thought, a behavior, or an emotional reaction, you strengthen the circuit behind it. It becomes faster, more automatic, more familiar. And the reverse is also true. Pathways that you stop using begin to weaken. This process, sometimes called synaptic pruning, is one of the most hopeful ideas in neuroscience because it means old patterns don't just stay forever. They can fade if you stop reinforcing them. And that's exactly what began happening for my client. She stopped automatically feeding that pattern and started interrupting it, even imperfectly. It slowly began to lose its grip. But here's where it gets more complex. Your brain doesn't just store your past, body does too. And you may have heard of the psychiatrist Bessa van der Kolk. Spent decades studying trauma and came to a conclusion that changed how we understand healing, that trauma isn't just a memory, it's a physical state. It shows up in how you breathe when you feel unsafe, in the tension you carry without noticing, in the way your body reacts before your mind has time to catch up. And for a long time, this confused me because I understood my patterns, I could explain them, I could analyze them. My body was still reacting as if threat was real. And that's the key insight. Understanding the pattern is not the same as rewiring it. This is why purely cognitive approaches often fall short. You can't just think your way out of a nervous system that has learned to stay on high alert. You have to work with the body as well, because patterns don't only live in your thoughts, they live in your breathing, muscle tension, your stress responses, your emotional reflexes. Over time, your nervous system learns what to expect from the world and it begins to react accordingly, which is why change can feel so difficult at first. Even when you consciously want something different, your body may still be running an older survival pattern underneath it. It's like software programming. But the hopeful part is this: the nervous system can learn new patterns too. Repetition, safety, and consistency, your brain and body can begin to respond differently, which means you can change what you repeatedly do, not just changing a habit, you're changing the system underneath it. That brings us to the question everyone wants answered, of course: how long does this actually take? Because you've probably heard the 21-day rule. It sounds neat, it sounds motivated. It's also not accurate. The real timeline is very different. And there was a landmark study that was published in the European Journal of Social Psychology. It tracked how long it actually takes for new behaviours to become automatic. What they found challenges one of the most common myths. On average, it took 66 days for a new behaviour to feel automatic. Not 21, not 30, 66. Here's the part most people miss. The range was actually huge. For some behaviours, it actually took as little as 18 days. For others, up to 254. So, what explains that difference? Not willpower, complexity. The more emotionally charged the pattern, the more deeply it has been reinforced, the more layers it involves: thoughts, feelings, behaviours. And so the longer it takes to rewire, which makes sense, right? I worked with a client who wanted to stop avoiding difficult conversations. On the surface, it seemed simple, just speak up. But underneath, there were years of fear, past conflict, and a nervous system that was associating speaking up with danger. So this wasn't a 21-day habit, it was a process. And that's the distinction that most people miss. If you're changing something simple, like adding a short walk into your day, you might see change relatively quickly. But if you're trying to shift deep emotional patterns, your self-beliefs, your responses that were shaped over years or decades, you're not looking at weeks, you're looking at months. And that isn't failure, that's biology. For those of you who are neurodivergent, I want to say this clearly. If change feels slower for you, it does not mean your brain is faulty in any way. In many cases, it means your brain actually forms stronger patterns, more detailed, more emotionally encoded, more persistent, which means, yes, new patterns can take more time and more repetition to establish. But there's an upside here. It also means that when they do form, they can become incredibly strong and stable. So it isn't a limitation, it's just a different starting point. And it requires something most people are never taught or struggle with: patience, consistency, and the ability to recognize progress before it feels automatic. So what actually works? What does research and real life tell us about how to genuinely rewire your brain? Let's break this down then. First, awareness. This one surprises people. The neuroscientist Jeffrey Schwartz found that simply observing your thoughts without immediately reacting creates distance between the trigger and the response. And that distance is where the change begins. I worked with a client who would spiral into anxiety every time they made a small mistake. Instead of trying to stop the anxiety, I asked them to do something different. Just notice it. Here's the panic. Here's the thought that I've messed everything up. At first, nothing changed, but over time, that tiny moment of observation started to interrupt that automatic loop. It's not just mindset, that's neurobiology. Second, new experiences in a state of safety. Your nervous system doesn't just learn from logic, it learns from experience. Approaches like those developed by Peter Levine show that the body needs to feel safe, not just think it is, in order to update those older patterns. I worked with someone who avoided social situations completely, not because they didn't want connection, because their body associated people with threat. We didn't start with big changes. We started with small, short, safe interactions, predictable environments. Slowly, their nervous system began to learn something new. This is different now. Third, safe relationships. This is one of the most powerful and most underestimated tools for change. Brain develops in relationship and it heals in relationship. And this is why therapy is so helpful. I've seen clients make more progress in the context of one genuinely safe, consistent relationship than in months of trying to do everything alone. Because when you experience someone responding to you with calm, safety, and consistency, your nervous system begins to recalibrate itself. That process, called co-regulation, it's not abstract, it's biological. Fourth, repetition with emotional engagement. Repetition alone isn't enough. You can repeat something 100 times and nothing changes if there is no emotional connection to it, because the brain is constantly filtering the significant, and emotion is what tells the brain this matters. I worked with a client who used to use positive affirmations and repeated them for years with almost no effect. Every morning, I'm worthy, I'm enough, I deserve love. But they said the words mechanically. Nothing in their nervous system believed them. Then one session, after talking about a painful memory from childhood, they stopped mid-sentence and quietly said, I think I've been speaking to myself the way other people spoke to me. For the first time, there was emotion behind what they were saying, not performance, not forced positivity, real feeling. Later, when they tried a more compassionate response towards themselves, they suddenly paused and said, that felt different. That moment mattered more than years of repetition before it, because emotionally charged experiences create stronger neural encoding. The brain remembers what it feels, which means change happens faster when the emotional system is involved, not just the intellectual one. Fifth, sleep. This one is not optional. Sleep is where your brain consolidates what you practice during the day. It's where emotional experiences are processed, memories are stabilized, and neural connections are strengthened. Without enough sleep, the brain struggles to hold on to change. I worked with a client who was so deeply committed to healing. They were journaling consistently, practicing awareness, interrupting old patterns. They were also sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, and they kept saying, why does it feel like I keep resetting? Because in many ways they were. Their nervous system never had enough recovery time to properly integrate what they were learning. Everything stayed emotionally louder, reactive, more fragile. So before we added more techniques, we focused on sleep, regular bedtime, less stimulation at night, consistency, nothing dramatic. Within weeks, they noticed something important. The emotional spirals weren't hitting as hard anymore. They had more space before reacting, resilience, stability, because the brain finally had the conditions it needed to store the change. I think this matters because people often judge themselves for struggling without realizing how exhausted their nervous system really is. Sometimes the issue isn't lack of effort, it's a lack of restoration. Sixth, movement, not just for physical health, but for your nervous system. Brain isn't separate from the body, and sometimes psychological change begins physiologically first. Rhythmic movement like walking, running, swimming, cycling, rowing helps regulate stress hormones, release tension, and create a greater sense of safety in the body. I worked with someone who used to constantly feel on edge. Even during calm moments, their body felt braced. Thing to happen. They kept trying to think their way out of anxiety, analyze it, reason with it, understand it. But insight alone wasn't calming their nervous system. So instead of starting with deep emotional work, we started with something much simpler, daily walk, but without podcasts, no self-improvement content, just movement. At first, they thought it was a bit pointless, but after a few weeks, they noticed they were sleeping better. Their thoughts felt less chaotic. Their body didn't feel quite as tightly wound all the time. And that created enough internal safety for deeper emotional work to finally become possible. I think people often underestimate this part because movement can seem too simple. But the nervous system responds powerfully to rhythm, motion, and physical regulation. Think about rocking a baby. Sometimes the body has to settle before the mind can change. So non-linear, not the same as not working. Change does not look like steady progress. It looks like improvement, followed by setbacks, followed by progress again. And I've had clients tell me, I thought I was doing better, and then I reacted again. But when we look closely, the reaction is different. Slightly slower, slightly more aware. That's change, even when it doesn't feel like it. Psychologist Rick Hansen talks about something called taking in the good. Our brains are wired to hold on to negative experiences more strongly than positive ones. So positive moments can pass you by very quickly unless you deliberately stay with them. So I often ask clients to do something simple. When something feels good, safe, calm, connected, stay with it for 20 to 30 seconds, like really soak it in. I worked with a client who initially thought that felt pointless, but after a few weeks, again, they noticed something shift. I'm starting to feel those good moments more instead of them just disappearing. That's not imagination. Now that's rewiring. So let's bring all this together. Realistically, meaningful brain change, especially for emotional patterns, takes time. At the lower end, around 66 days. But for deeper patterns, you're often looking at several months. And that timeline depends on your consistency, your environment, your support, and your individual brain, which means this is not about rushing the process. It's about working with how your brain actually changes. If you are neurodivergent, if you have experienced significant trauma, if you feel things deeply and intensely yourself, a longer timeline, not because you are less capable, but because you are doing deeper work. So let's bring this back to something practical. The 6 things that matter most. Let's summarize those. Build awareness, observe, don't just react. Seek safe relationships. Your nervous system heals in connection. Repetition with real emotional engagement. Protect your sleep. Move your body regularly and deliberately take in positive experiences instead of letting them pass you by. None of this is easy, but all of it is possible. Today, I'm still a chartered psychologist, still neurodivergent, still someone who feels things deeply, but the difference is this. Patterns are no longer running the show in the same way. Wiring has changed, not because I found any shortcuts, but because I worked with my brain consistently, imperfectly, and with far more self-compassion than I thought I deserved. And you can do this too. If this video helped, share it with someone who needs it. And if you're in this process right now, tell me where you are in the comments. Subscribe if you want more psychology that's honest, evidence-based, and actually applicable to real life. You're not behind, you're in the process, and that's exactly where the change happens.